King John's reign became a true catastrophe, a stunning example of the destructive power of a cruel and perverted tyrant. This ruthless ruler watched as his once mighty empire was literally reduced to ashes under the weight of his mistakes and insane decisions, while fires of discontent and anarchy spread around him. Furthermore, he gradually distanced himself from all those who had once called him an ally, making each of his actions increasingly alienating and destructive. It's no surprise that when this madman finally met his end, it was so brutal and bloody that his death became remembered as one of the most terrifying and painful in history. The image of King John is often seen by contemporaries as an example of a treacherous villain who seized the throne by exploiting the weakness and helplessness of Robin Hood and his allies. However, his true personality was far more complex than it appears at first glance. Born as the fourth son into a respected but troubled family, he was merely a shadow of his older brothers. His father, King Henry II, ruled a vast empire that encompassed not only England, but also nearly half of French lands. John's mother, famous and treacherous Eleanor of Aquitaine, focused mainly on intrigues and conspiracies, rarely finding time for her son, as her attention was primarily on the struggle for power and influence. Despite his wealth and status, John, like his brothers Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, was just a prestigious bride price for family ambitions. The older brothers already had significant inheritances and prospects, while he had nothing. Essentially, he was left to his own devices, and his entire destiny was shaped in the shadow of family intrigues and power struggles. Their parents had no intention of sharing real authority, and as he grew older, the situation only worsened. His father, King Henry II, justified his unassailable power by restricting the authority of his heirs, which fostered dissatisfaction and a desire for independence among them. By the time John reached an age where he could understand what was happening, the entire English Empire was already transforming into a landscape of constant conflicts and internal wars. Internal discord and distrust within the family reached their peak. All the sons fought for their own interests. King Henry continued to control key castles and lands, including those in France, granting them to his children. However, a great disappointment arose when one of the key fortresses, the one located in France, promised to the youngest John, among others, was already promised to the eldest son, Henry. The young King Henry, who wanted to hold more power and feared that his father would give even more lands to his heir, became indignant and rebelled against his father. He was not alone in this. John's mother, Eleanor, also distrusted her husband and believed that his interference in family affairs was a sign of weakness and greed. Part 2 of 8. Thus, the interests of the elder and younger heirs conflicted, and the situation only intensified. Against the backdrop of tense family conflicts and unwavering political intrigues, the young king and his brothers found themselves in a situation where they had to unite against their common enemy, their father. The internal state of their family circle was completely shattered. All bonds were torn apart, and the situation escalated as revolts and disagreements raged around them. However, despite this, it was John, the young heir, who had the strongest reason and opportunity to extract the maximum benefit from the constant disputes. He was close to his father, being the last of the remaining faithful sons, and it was he for whom the true struggle was fought during this difficult period. The longer their internal conflict lasted, the more lands King Henry II had to cede to John. Meanwhile, the king often simply confiscated large estates from his noble vassals to give to his son, thereby strengthening the latter's position. Among the wealthy and influential nobles in England, the Earl of Gloucester stood out, one of the wealthiest landowners with vast holdings. Planning to leave part of his lands to his numerous daughters, he was struck with surprise when the king did the opposite. He disinherited all of the earl's daughters except one, Isabel. Following this, he arranged for John to be betrothed to this very Isabel, making him one of the wealthiest men in the entire empire. At that time, both John and Isabel were still children, but they already shared a blood relationship. They were relatives through an ancient lineage. Their common ancestor, King Henry II, was their great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather, which made their marriage closer by right than what was permissible under church laws regarding consanguinity. The Archbishop of Canterbury considered such a connection unacceptable and forbade both from marrying. Henry II, disagreeing with this decision, sought permission directly from the Pope, who ultimately consented to the marriage between John and Isabel on the condition that they would not share a bed. John was a typical representative of medieval aristocracy. He grew up surrounded by luxury and riches, with a passion for books and a collection of rare editions that he carried with him on travels. His hobbies matched neither his wealth. He owned a rich library, a luxurious wardrobe filled with the most expensive clothes, and numerous jewelry pieces that he collected with passion. All this seemed quite normal, albeit somewhat eccentric, except for the fact that everyone who knew John quickly noticed there was something more hidden within him than just wealth. His behavior often showed mood swings. He could shatter sound barriers. He was extremely sensitive, very jealous, and prone to sudden bursts of fiery anger. In the blink of an eye, his mood could change, and sometimes he exhibited a tendency toward violence, which posed a danger to those around him. During moments of intense anger, he often gnawed on his own fingers, unable to cope with his internal tension. All of this, however, was hidden behind his rich attire and bright appearance. People who knew him soon noticed that beneath this shiny facade lay a clever and very cunning individual, capable of being treacherous and merciless. That is why John became one of the most dangerous figures in his circle. Constant conflicts within his family, the struggle for power and influence, nearly led to his own destruction. The first victim in this story was John's elder brother, Henry. The young king began fighting with his relative, his second brother Richard, aiming to conquer some minor territory or secure advantageous conditions. But he aimed too high, overreaching himself far beyond what he desired. Ultimately, the conflict yielded nothing of significance, and its only result was a painful and agonizing death caused by dysentery. His entire dynasty lost the primary heir, the future emperor after Henry II, which triggered a chain of gradual changes. All family members began to pull the blanket over themselves as the situation grew increasingly tense and strained. As a result, Henry, in his attempt to retain power, appointed his eldest son Richard as King of England and entrusted his younger son John to govern the lands previously held by Richard, the territory known as Aquitaine. Richard wasn't willing to give up such a rich and strategically important land easily. He insistently clung to his positions, stubbornly refused to make concessions, and the situation reached a deadlock. Then, an angry Henry ordered John and his brother Geoffrey to assemble an army and forcibly take power in Aquitaine from Richard. Soon, both brothers besieged the capital, the city of Poitiers, which provoked Richard's counteractions. He attacked Geoffrey's lands in Brittany. The family discord was so severe that the family was turning into a real chaos, full of intrigues and struggles. After several years of confrontation, exhausting clashes, and prolonged conflicts, the situation stalled, and all family members gathered in England to declare a truce. Ultimately, Richard retained Aquitaine, and John gained control over its territory. However, the newly crowned king, still young, impulsive, and just shy of adolescence, experienced the taste of power for the first time, and he liked it very much. Henry II still aimed to expand his holdings for the sake of his beloved son, John. Why not try to conquer Ireland? He sent John with a large detachment to the Green Island to begin managing affairs there. Ultimately, John gained real authority, and his activities in Ireland were filled with mistakes, failures, and difficult decisions. Part 4 of 8. It's hard to imagine anyone doing worse in this matter than he did, as he faced a serious problem. Ireland had only recently been conquered by the Angevins, and the local population remained dissatisfied. He needed to act very delicately and carefully to regain control, But John behaved more like a bull in a china shop, restlessly, recklessly, with a strong desire to cause destruction. Throughout the year he spent in Ireland, he managed to anger the locals, alienate almost all of his supporters among the Angevins, and lose significant territories due to rebellions by Irish insurgents. In the end, the young king returned to England embarrassed and ashamed, fully blaming his failures on those he considered responsible, primarily Viscount Guy D. This was only the beginning of a series of even more difficult trials awaiting him in the following years. The years of failure and disappointment left their mark on Henry II. He grew old and weakened, and his brother Richard sensed his father's vulnerability, like a predator detecting the scent of blood in the water. It was necessary to act, and Richard decided to unite with King Philip II of France to declare war on his ailing father. In this unexpected turn of events, after a lifetime of loyalty to his father, Henry II suddenly changed his allegiances and sided with Richard. The king himself was no longer able to resist. Eventually, he raised the white flag, submitted to his son's demands, and soon died. After his death, power passed to Richard, who became the new King of England. But he had only one main priority: to embark on the Crusades and fight in the Holy Land. He passionately desired to take part in the struggle for faith in the distant East, but fully understood that it involved great risks. He had spent his whole life embroiled in disputes and conflicts with his parents and brothers, especially concerning the legacy of the English Empire, and he knew that someone might try to seize it the moment he went to war. To ensure his younger brother's loyalty, Richard decided to give him generous gifts, vast territories. He granted John the lands of Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and Nottingham. Deep down, he hoped that with such wealth, John would merely watch over the empire while his brother fought the Saracens in the Holy Land. However, Richard did not forget about the future heir. He designated his 4-year-old nephew Arthur as successor to the throne and demanded that John promise not to set foot on English soil for 3 years. According to Richard, this period would give his brother time to go on the crusade, and upon his return, he could reclaim his throne. John readily agreed. He knew well that he would never dare attempt to usurp his brother's throne. Soon, John began to act. He understood that the English were displeased with Richard's rule and hoped to take advantage of this discontent. He convinced his mother, Eleanor, to persuade Richard to allow him to return to England. The king agreed, and John quickly crossed the English Channel, establishing himself at the royal court and presenting himself as a likely ruler of the country. Years passed, and Richard remained somewhere far away, on a crusade, as if he were not one of England's rulers, and had not returned. Soon, the inhabitants of the country began to see John as the de facto ruler, and some even hinted that he might become the next king. During this time, John spread rumors that Richard had been killed during his crusades. However, these rumors proved false. Richard was still alive, and in fact, he had even begun to prepare for his return, strengthening his position and moving to restore his authority and reclaim the throne to which he had been crowned. After many years living abroad, fate brought him back to his homeland once again. Unfortunately, it was Duke Leopold of Austria who intercepted him on the way and handed him over to the ruthless Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, who became his executioner. This was the only opportunity John could grasp at that moment, and he decided not to miss it. During the events in England, conflicting forces emerged on both sides. Some supported King Richard, while others backed John, choosing his opponent's side. Ultimately, the conflict escalated into open combat, and the situation quickly grew more intense, turning quite brutal. Even though Richard was captured, John could not establish control over the country. His forces had little chance against those who remained loyal to King Richard. When, at last, Richard escaped captivity and slowly returned to England, the situation for John became hopeless. His armed troops surrendered immediately as soon as the king set foot on English soil. At that moment, he hastily left the country and headed to Normandy, hoping that his brother, being in foreign territory, would forget the treachery. However, Shortly thereafter, Richard caught up with him and regained control. Richard's response to his brother's betrayal, surprising many, turned out to be unexpectedly gentle. Despite his reputation as a fierce warrior, the King Knight, known as the Lion of the Crossroad, one of the Crusaders, actually showed inner kindness. He forgave his 20-year-old brother, saying that he was merely a child, misled by bad advisors. After his reckless and failed rebellion, John waited for the right moment for another attempt to seize power. The opportunity arose when Richard was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder, and his wound soon began to fester. The king warrior gradually weakened, his health deteriorated, and in 1199 he died, leaving behind a vacuum of power. We had to face a real succession crisis. The situation after Richard's death was chaotic and tangled. There were two claimants to the throne, John and his nephew, the young warrior Arthur. The situation was complicated further by the Norman legal system. Under Norman law, the right to the throne belonged to John, whereas according to the Norman, Viking-derived customary law, it was Arthur's. As a result, the conflict soon escalated into open warfare. John was already dealing with one dangerous ally, so why not strike a deal this time as well? He agreed to a peace treaty with the King of France, Philip. Shortly after Richard's death, according to the terms of the agreement, Philip recognized John as the heir to the throne, while John, in turn, acknowledged Philip as his feudal overlord over the French lands. This diplomatic maneuver provoked outrage among the Normans, who dubbed the newly crowned king disturbed and feeble. In their eyes, he appeared weak and incapable of defending his country's interests, which undermined his authority. When it seems that the enemy has reached the peak of their cruelty and treachery, they often find new ways to inflict suffering. Likewise, King John displayed astonishing cruelty and brazenness in his behavior. Not content with failures in foreign affairs and the loss of his possessions, he decided to replace his wife, adding a dose of unyielding self-confidence to his image. According to the medieval customs, where cases of repeated names were common, his new bride was another woman named Isabella. However, we cannot say exactly how old this Isabella of Angoulême was when she married John, although historians agree she was too young even for that era. By then, she was already betrothed to another man, the powerful Guy IX of Lusignan, who was also a political rival to the king. Guy, unwilling to tolerate betrayal and steadfastly pursuing his own interests, directly approached the King of France, Philip. He demanded that John come to Paris and clarify the circumstances of his behavior. But the king, who clearly did not like this demand, decided to stay in his castle with his young wife and refused to obey. Enraged and feeling insulted, Philip did not wait and decided to use force. He took all of John's French territories, including the historic ancestral homeland, Normandy. Now, deprived of his holdings outside England, John was forced to resume military actions, fighting for his independence and rights. All of this began over his desire to marry a young girl. Among his relatives was another claimant to the throne, his nephew Arthur, who was still alive and considered by many to be a contender for the English crown. In his effort to eliminate the competition, John organized his kidnapping, imprisoned him, and simply discarded the key. No one has seen Arthur since. Modern historians believe that King John probably murdered his nephew and threw his body into the Swine River in 1204. On one of the most difficult days, the king received terrible news. His mother, Elena of Aquitaine, had died. Her strength and determination in governing this important region had been the main support for John. Hearing this, Philip did not hesitate. He immediately took decisive action. The French king invaded the land and quickly seized Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou. As a result, only England and Aquitaine remained on the map, the remnants of the once powerful Anglo-French Empire. Further defeats followed, which finally crushed John's hopes of restoring his dominance. His armies were defeated, and he was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. This document marked the last nail in his attempts to regain lost territories. After all these hardships, the king swiftly returned to England to develop new plans and look for ways to preserve his throne. The circumstances for this ruler worsened daily, gradually plunging him into deeper despair. Eventually, the barons, dissatisfied with King John's tyrannical rule, decided to take matters into their own hands. They gathered their own army and moved against the royal authority with the firm intention of seizing London by force. In a short time, they managed to capture this significant center, after which several nobles loyal to John defected and joined the rebels. Under these conditions, the monarch had fewer and fewer options. He had to raise the white flag and sign one of the most humiliating and disgraceful treaties in English history. The barons forced the king to sign Magna Carta, which significantly limited his power and established unprecedented boundaries for royal authority, effectively depriving the monarch of almost all sovereignty. This was undoubtedly the lowest point in John's life and reign, a true fatal collapse. However, even such a defeat as signing this famous charter did not mark the end of the struggle for the king. Although Magna Carta became one of the most well-known documents in history, it did not ensure real power or the enforcement of its terms by either the king or the barons. Over time, both sides stopped considering it binding, and soon afterward, they took up arms again, rebuilt their armies, and sought to resolve their disagreements by force. In an original and perhaps most shocking manner, the rebels even invited the French Prince Louis to join the military actions, since, in this case, ruling would be better than under King John's leadership. Thus began the First Barons' War, which turned out to be a terrible end to an already disastrous reign of Louis. During fierce military clashes, both sides found themselves in a deadlock, where advantages shifted from one to the other, and the outcome seemed unpredictable. Stubborn John continued to personally lead his troops from the front lines, which ultimately played a fateful role. He was mortally wounded by gangrene, a very painful and terrifying form of the disease, and despite that, he persistently pressed on through the countryside, firmly determined to put an end to the rebellious barons once and for all. Gangrene is one of the most terrible and agonizing illnesses, and dying from it became a deserved punishment for his horrific deeds and cruel rule. Eventually, he found refuge in Nottingham Castle, located in Nottinghamshire, where his body finally failed him and his heart stopped in October of the year 1216, just over a year after he signed the Magna Carta. Over the last 10 years of his reign, King John governed the country, imprisoning his relative, niece, Eleanor. She had a rightful claim to the throne, as she possessed royal claims, but to prevent a possible uprising, the king locked her away in captivity. In a final act of malice and revenge, John even changed his will to include a prohibition on her release, a move that clearly demonstrated his ruthless nature and complete lack of mercy. Today, the name of King John is forever remembered as one of the most underestimated and despised rulers of England. He undoubtedly earned this reputation, leaving a vivid mark in the historical memory of the people. His reign became so contradictory that his name has become a symbol of failure and injustice in royal authority. In studying this era, we learn about the reasons that led to such perceptions of his personality and actions. If you are interested in delving into the captivating and vivid pages of history and discovering its most unusual and important moments, further exploration is worthwhile. Do not forget to show interest in our materials. To continue learning new facts, share them with your friends and loved ones. After all, this is how we can expand our knowledge together and better understand the past. Especially for those who want to learn more, we have created our main online portal, the Fact Tate page, where astonishing and often little-known facts about everything under the sun are presented.